Picture this. It is 20,000 years ago, so there is no houses, no cities, no police, no flashlights, no Uber, no share my location feature. It's just you, a campfire, and several hundred pounds of hungry wolf wondering if you are on the menu. Now, imagine trying to explain that world around you to someone else. You would tell them things like, I hear howling out in the darkness. There were strange tracks near my camp. Someone disappeared into the woods and a body turned up weeks later. Suddenly, a question begins to form now. What if that thing hunting us isn't entirely wolf? What if it's human, too? Because long before Hollywood ever gave us shirt-ripping transformations and CGI monsters, the werewolf existed in the darkest corners of the human imagination. And the weirdest part? Almost every single culture seems to have invented some version of the werewolf. So tonight we're diving into that history. We're going to cover ancient wolf gods, cursed kings, Viking wolf warriors, medieval werewolf trials, feral children, psychological experiments, and the science that may explain why humanity has been obsessed with wolfmen for thousands of years. But hang on, before we dive in, if you enjoy things like dark history and mythology, strange psychology, cryptids, conspiracies, humanity's long tradition of making terrible decisions, then hit the subscribe button and stick around. Then let me know down in the comments, if you encountered a werewolf in the woods, what would be your survival strategy? Personally, mine is really simple. I would just die immediately. Save time, right? Anyway, pull up a chair, keep your hands and feet inside of the campfire circle at all times, and let's follow the werewolf legend from ancient mythology all the way to modern science. Before we dive in too far, one of the biggest misconceptions about werewolves is that they began as monsters. They did not. They actually began as explanations. And to understand why, we have to go back in time when wolves were not some fantasy creature. They were a very real problem. Today, most people encounter wolves through things like documentaries or Disney movies, but ancient humans encountered them through something called being eaten. Now, for most of human history, wolves were among the most feared predators found in Europe, Asia, and North America. They competed with humans for food, they would stalk livestock, and occasionally attack people, especially small children. To early societies, wolves represented something truly terrifying. They were the wilderness itself, the unknown, the thing waiting beyond the safety of the campfire. And because humans are storytelling creatures, they began asking a very natural question. What if the real danger wasn't really just wolves? What if it was humans becoming wolves? All right, so we talked a little bit about wolves being predators and humanity's fear of the wilderness, but eventually something in there starts to change, and the wolf stops being just an animal and starts becoming something much bigger, like a symbol, a warning, a spiritual force, a monster, and in some cultures, something to admire. Because one of the strangest things about human history is that almost every single civilization looked at wolves and came to one of two conclusions. Either that thing is evil or I want to be that thing. And honestly, both are a little bit concerning. Let's start with one of the most famous wolf stories ever told, the story of Romulus and Remus, the legendary founders of Rome. Now, this story has everything. You've got power, betrayal, attempted murder, divine intervention, sibling rivalry, and eventually actual murder, which means it fits perfectly into Roman history. The story begins in the ancient city of Alba Longa. A king named Numitor ruled the city. Now, unfortunately, his brother Romulus decided that sharing power was just simply overrated, so he decided to steal the throne, because apparently ancient royal succession worked exactly like a hostile workplace takeover, just, with more swords. Anyway, Romulus had one major problem. Numitor still had descendants, and descendants eventually became claimants, and claimants eventually became revolutions. So Romulus looked at Numitor's daughter, Rhea Silva, and decided to eliminate the problem before it could even start. He forced her to become a Vestal Virgin, which is a priestess that's sworn to never have children. Problem solved, right? Not really. According to the legend, the god Mars took an interest in Rhea Silva, and before long, she gave birth to two twin boys, Romulus and Remus. Romulus immediately panicked because nothing ruins a coup quite like surprise heirs, so he ordered the babies to be killed. Now, here's where history gets really interesting. The servant that was assigned to carry out the execution simply just couldn't do it. Instead, he placed the twins in a basket and sent them drifting down the river, which really sounds like a terrible childcare plan, but apparently it worked out. The basket became lodged near the riverbank, and the babies survived. And, according to Roman legend, a she-wolf found them. Okay, now stop for a second and let's imagine this scene, okay? A wolf emerges from the trees. She sees two abandoned infants and they're crying. She approaches cautiously and sniffs them, and then, instead of eating them, she lies down beside them and feeds them, protects them, raises them. Now, eventually a shepherd named Faustulus discovered the boys and he took them home. The twins grew into powerful young men and they eventually overthrow Romulus. They restore their grandfather to power and then they set out to build their own city. Now, unfortunately, this is where things start to kind of go downhill because the brothers start to argue over where they're going to build this city. The argument then escalates and Romulus kills Remus, which is probably the most Roman ending possible. Romulus then went on to found Rome, a city that would eventually conquer much of the known world, and according to its own mythology, it all started with a wolf. Now, was it really a wolf? It's actually pretty fascinating to dive into this question because many historians don't actually think the wolf was necessarily a wolf. See, in Latin, the word lupa could mean two things, she-wolf or prostitute. Now, a lot of scholars think that the twins may have actually been rescued by a woman who was just kind of living on the edge of society, a woman who eventually later transformed into a wolf through centuries of storytelling, but at the time she was probably actually more like a prostitute that wasn't part of mainstream society. Now, other people think that the wolf was more of a symbolic thing representing things like survival, strength, wilderness, and the untamed frontier. But what's really important in this story isn't whether or not that part's literally true. It's really that Rome, the greatest empire in the ancient world, looked at the wolf and saw something admirable. It saw strength, power, survival. The wolf was not viewed as a monster. It was viewed as a symbol of what Rome wanted to become. And that idea appeared all over the ancient world. Now, let's travel to ancient Greece because the Greeks took one look at wolves and said, what if becoming a wolf is actually a punishment? And thus enters Lycaon, the man responsible for every werewolf ever made, indirectly anyway. So anyway, Lycaon was a king and according to Greek mythology, also an idiot because he decided the best way to test whether Zeus was actually a real god was to serve him human flesh. Now, I don't know who needs to hear this, but if your plan involves tricking the king of the gods into cannibalism, you are going to have a really bad day, my friend. Now, Zeus was absolutely not amused at all, and he struck Lycaon down and transformed him into a wolf, a creature that reflected the savagery that he already possessed on the inside. And this is really important because early werewolf stories weren't necessarily about physical transformation. They were about morality. The Greeks weren't saying he became a wolf. They were saying he acted like a wolf. And from Lycaon's name, we get lycanthropy, the word that's still used today for werewolf transformations. Now, while the Greeks were turning bad kings into wolves, the Vikings were doing something completely different. They wanted to become wolves on purpose. Enter the Ulfhethnar, or the Wolfcoats. They were elite Norse warriors who wore wolf pelts into battle. Now, ancient accounts describe them as being fearless, relentless, and almost animalistic. They fought in frenzied states. They ignored pain, they charged directly into combat, and they absolutely terrified their enemies. Imagine you're a farmer drafted into some medieval army. Across the battlefield, you see these giant men wearing wolf skins and screaming like lunatics, sprinting towards you with axes. At that point, you are no longer conducting scientific analysis. You're deciding whether playing dead is a viable strategy. To many enemies, these warriors did not seem human anymore. They looked like they had transformed. And historians believe that the stories like these may have actually helped to shape later werewolf legends. Because if enough people tell stories about wolfmen, eventually someone starts to believe them. But then people started wondering, why wolves? And that really is a great question to ask because why not bear? Why not deer? Why not squirrels? I mean, think about it. Were-squirrels would be terrifying in a completely different way. But the answer is really simple. For thousands of years, wolves were humanity's closest rival predator. They lived where we lived, they hunted where we hunted, they raised families, they worked together, they protected their packs, and in many ways, they looked uncomfortably similar to us. The wolf became a mirror, sometimes reflecting humanity at its best, being loyal, protective, and strong, but sometimes reflecting humanity at its worst, being violent, predatory, and cruel. And we're about to see that once Europe entered the Middle Ages, that mirror turned into an absolute nightmare. So far, we have seen wolves as heroes or symbols or warriors, but now we're going to dive into the point where things just kind of go off the rails. It's when Europe lost its mind, because eventually they stopped asking, what if people can become wolves? And they started asking, which one of my neighbors is actually a wolf? And believe me, that is a much more dangerous question. We're now entering the late Middle Ages and early modern period, roughly the 1400s through the 1600s, and Europe is having what historians would politely call a difficult time. Let's look at the overall situation. The continent is dealing with famine, war, disease, religious conflict, political instability, and enough paranoia to power the internet for centuries. People are desperate for answers, and when people become desperate, they start looking for monsters. We've seen this happen repeatedly throughout history with things like the Salem witch trials, the Satanic Panic, alien abductions, internet conspiracy theories. Human beings just hate uncertainty. We would rather have a bad explanation than have no explanation at all. And medieval Europe was absolutely no different. When livestock started to disappear, it wasn't just bad luck, it was witches. When children would vanish, it wasn't criminals, it was monsters. When bodies appeared in forests, it wasn't a murderer, it was a werewolf. And that is exactly how one of history's strangest criminal panics began. Now, if medieval Europe had a celebrity werewolf, Peter Stump would be it. He was a farmer living in Bedburg during the late 1500s. By all accounts, he seemed fairly normal, which, historically speaking, is usually how these stories start. Nobody ever says, well, he lived in a cave, wore squirrel bones as jewelry, and screamed at clouds. No, it's always, he seemed like a pretty nice guy. Then things started happening. Livestock began being found mutilated, and people started disappearing. Bodies were discovered in fields and forests, and witnesses began reporting a strange, large wolf that was stalking the countryside. Not really unusual by itself. I mean, Germany was known to have a lot of wolves, like a whole lot of wolves. The unusual part was that the villagers began claiming that the creature behaved very strangely. It was a little bit too intelligent. It was a little bit too deliberate. It was almost human. Now, eventually, suspicion landed on Peter Stump, and from there, things escalated rather quickly because medieval investigations were not exactly what we would call evidence-based. Today, detectives would collect DNA, but back then, they collected rumors. Peter was arrested and he was tortured repeatedly, and eventually he confessed to everything, and I mean like literally everything. According to his confession, the devil had given him a magical belt, and when he wore it, he would transform into a gigantic wolf. Not a normal wolf, a supernatural wolf. He was stronger, faster, deadlier, basically the medieval equivalent of unlocking a video game skin. He claimed that he spent years prowling the countryside, killing livestock, killing travelers, killing women, killing children, and according to his confession, he even practiced cannibalism. Now, here's where modern historians start to really pump the brakes because torture produces terrible information. If someone is being tortured long enough, they will eventually confess to being a werewolf, or a dragon, or the inventor of gravity, whatever makes the pain stop. Now, that doesn't mean that Stump was necessarily innocent. Far from it. A lot of historians believe that he may have actually been a genuine serial killer. Others think he became a convenient scapegoat for multiple crimes. The truth is, we're probably never going to actually know the truth. What we do know is how the story ended, and it was brutal, even by medieval standards. First, they tied him to a wheel. Then heated pincers were used to tear the flesh from his body, his limbs were broken, his body was executed, his remains were burned, and his head was displayed publicly. Because this wasn't just punishment, it was theater. It was a message. The authorities weren't simply killing a criminal. They were reassuring terrified villagers that the monster was dead. And that idea is really important because Peter Stump was not the last werewolf that Europe would have to hunt. Not even close. Now, if Peter Stump were Germany's celebrity werewolf, Zélie Garnier was Francis. And honestly, his story sounds like the opening scene of a horror movie. Garnier lived alone out in the woods outside of Dole. Now, to be fair, living alone in the woods does not necessarily make someone suspicious, but in 16th century Europe, it absolutely did. Remember, these are people who thought tomatoes would probably kill you, so the bar for suspicion was pretty darn low. Then, children started disappearing, and witnesses reported seeing a wolf-like creature dragging victims into the forest. Search parties formed immediately, and fear spread, rumors exploded, and eventually, authorities began to focus on Garnier. Under interrogation, he eventually confessed, and according to his story, a spirit appeared to him and offered him an ointment. If he rubbed the ointment on his body, he would transform into a wolf and go hunt. Again, modern historians aren't exactly rushing to accept the magical ointment explanation, but what's fascinating is that the confession reflects what people already believed. The werewolf was not just an animal. It was someone who willingly abandoned humanity, someone who chose savagery. And in many ways, that's a lot scarier than a monster because monsters are easy. Humans are complicated. Okay, now here's where things start to get really weird. And by weird, I mean medieval Europe has clearly run out of hobbies weird because we're going to talk about the Gévaudan family. They were a French family and they were accused of lycanthropy in the late 1500s. Multiple family members were arrested after a series of attacks. Authorities described them as animal-like, aggressive, crawling on all fours, covered in dirt, unusually hairy. And at this time, this was considered compelling evidence. Today, it really sounds more like, congratulations, you've discovered poor hygiene. But the authorities genuinely believed that they were looking at a family of werewolves. And this tells us something very important. Europe was not just afraid of wolves anymore. Europe had become afraid of human nature itself. Then we have the Beast of Gévaudan. And this is one of the biggest werewolf stories in history. I mean, like the heavyweight champion, the Super Bowl of monster panics, okay? Beginning in 1764, something started attacking people across rural France. Not sheep, not cattle, people, and mostly women and children. The attacks were incredibly vicious. Bodies were mutilated. Witnesses described the thing that did it as having enormous size, reddish fur, unusual markings, incredible speed, complete fearlessness around humans. And here's the most fascinating part. Wolves normally avoid humans. This creature absolutely did not. It was actively targeting them. So, of course, panic spread all throughout France. Professional hunters arrived, soldiers arrived, the king even got involved, entire hunting expeditions were organized, thousands of people were searching for this thing. Now, eventually, a hunter named Jean Chastel killed a very large wolf-like animal, and the attacks largely stopped, but nobody could actually agree on what really happened. Theories include an unusually large wolf, multiple wolves, a wolf-dog hybrid, a hyena that was imported from Africa, a lion, a trained exotic animal, and of course, multiple unrelated attacks that merged into one single legend. And naturally, the internet has added werewolf to the list because of course it has. Now, here's the real fascinating thing. When you look at all of these cases together, you start to notice a pattern. Europe wasn't actually hunting werewolves. Europe was trying to explain things that it just simply did not understand. Serial killers, predators, mental illness, violence, human cruelty. Once you strip away the magic belts, the devil packs, the transformation stories, the silver bullets, you find something much more frightening. Most of the monsters weren't wolves. They were just people. Now, at this point, we have spent thousands of years chasing werewolves throughout mythology and history. We've watched kings become wolves, warriors become wolves, murderers become wolves, entire villages convince themselves that their neighbors were wolves. And honestly, most of it falls apart the second you introduce any sort of evidence, which is usually a pretty bad sign when it comes to monsters, but then history does something really interesting. It hands us a mystery that is far stranger than any werewolf story, because eventually, scientists began encountering people who seem to exist somewhere between the human world and the animal world. Not because they transformed, not because they were cursed, and not because they were bitten during a full moon, but because they grew up without other humans, and the results of that is truly unsettling. So what actually makes a human human? Think about that for a second. What separates you from every other animal on Earth? Is it your body? Not really. We are physically weaker than most predators. We're slower than a lot of prey. And we would lose a fight to an angry goose more often than we would like to admit. Our advantage has always been something else. Language, culture, learning, the human connection. Everything we think of as being human is passed from one person to another. Parents teach children. Children learn from communities. Communities build civilizations. But what happens if that chain breaks? What happens if a child grows up without humanity? That question haunted scientists for centuries, and eventually they got some answers. Okay, let's head back in time again. It's the year 1800 and we're in southern France. Hunters and villagers have been reporting strange sightings of a figure moving through the forest. It seems kind of like a small person, but it's very fast, it's quiet, and it's quite wild. Now, at first, people assume it's some sort of animal, but then they get a closer look, and they realize it's a boy. He appears to be around 12 years old. He's absolutely filthy, covered in scars, barefoot, and completely alone. The child becomes known as Victor of Aveyron, and almost immediately, scientists became obsessed because Victor presented an opportunity that no one else had ever had before, to study a human being who may have grown up largely outside of society. Now, here's the strange part. Victor does not behave like other children, not even close. He rarely speaks. No, actually, scratch that. That's being generous. He really doesn't speak at all. He seems uninterested in social interactions. He shows little understanding of normal communication, and he appears far more comfortable outdoors than in. Cold weather really doesn't bother him. Loud noises don't seem to faze him, yet small environmental sounds instantly grab his attention. Doctors begin trying to teach him. One of them dedicates years of his life to this effort, and at first, he starts making a little bit of progress. Victor starts to learn routines, and he recognizes words. He develops emotional attachments, but something never seems to fully click in him. It was the language. It's the thing that humans do better than any species on Earth. Victor was never able to truly master it, and it's not because he wasn't intelligent, it's not because he wasn't trying, but because scientists eventually realized something really important. There may be a window during childhood when the brain expects language, and after that window closes, you can never fully reopen it. Now, today we call this the critical period hypothesis, but Victor helped to inspire that entire idea, and his case changed psychology forever because he forced scientists to confront something strange. Being human is not this automatic thing that happens. It has to be learned, and Victor wouldn't be the last person to raise that question, not even close. Now, if you've ever looked into feral children, you've probably heard about the two girls named Amala and Kamala, and their story sounds incredible, maybe a little bit too incredible. Now, according to the original account, these girls were discovered in India in the 1920s. They were living among wolves, they were running on all fours, they howled, they ate raw meat, they avoided people. It was the whole package. Now, the story exploded internationally. Newspapers loved it, books repeated it, and suddenly everyone had proof that wolf children existed. Except there was one little problem. The evidence was terrible. Almost everything we know about the case comes from a single source, a missionary named Joseph Emerito Lessing. There are no independent scientific observers, no photographs of the discovery, no modern documentation, and no way to verify almost any of the claims. And when later researchers dug into the case, things got even messier. Some records appeared inconsistent. Some details changed over time, and many experts began suspecting that the girls may have had developmental disabilities rather than being raised by wolves, which does not make this story any less important. In fact, that actually makes it more important because it teaches us something crucial. Humans don't just create monsters. Sometimes we create myths around people we just don't understand. And nowhere is that lesson clearer than in our next case. Okay, now this next one is real. There's no debate about it, no mystery, no century-old records. This happened pretty recently. We're in the Ukraine, and we're going to talk about a young girl named Oxana Malaya. She was neglected by her alcoholic parents, not just for a couple of days, not just for a couple of weeks, for years. And when a child has no human support system, they adapt. Behind the family's home was a kennel where a bunch of dogs lived, and eventually, so did Oxana. The dogs accepted her, and over time, she became a part of their social structure. She was part of the pack. When authorities discovered her at around the age of 8 years old, they found something extraordinary. She barked, she growled, she ran comfortably on all fours, she used body language more than speech, and she responded to the world in ways that resembled the animals around her. You can actually find a lot of videos showing this on YouTube. Look it up if you're interested. It's really pretty interesting. Anyway, one of the details that investigators often mention was how naturally she moved. This wasn't play, she wasn't pretending, she had genuinely adapted to her environment, moving on all fours. And then the saddest part, when people tried to remove her from the kennel, she resisted because from her perspective, she was not being rescued, she was being separated from her family. After years of therapy, she was able to relearn some of her language and social skills, but the case still remains one of the clearest examples of how profoundly environment shapes human behavior. But if that is not strange enough for you, science decided to test this theory directly. All right, so this brings us to one of the weirdest scientific studies ever conducted, and really it should have just stayed a thought in somebody's head. This is the story of Donald and Gua. You can also find a lot of information about this on the internet if you are interested in doing a deeper dive. It's actually quite fascinating. Apparently, someone looked at all the ethical red flags waving in the distance about, like, how can we test children being raised outside of society with animals, what would happen? And they were just like, hey, let's just see where this goes, because psychologist Winthrop Niles Kellogg wanted to answer a very fascinating question. What separates humans from other primates? Is it nature or is it environment? So he brought a baby chimpanzee named Gua into his home and raised her alongside his 10-month-old son, Donald, as siblings. I mean, they ate the same meal, played with the same toys, had the same lessons, they shared the same affection, they lived in the same household. Now, at first, everything seemed quite remarkable. Gua learned incredibly quickly, in some aspects quicker than Donald did. She was able to follow instructions and adapt to human routines. The experiment looked like an absolute success. But then something happened. Donald started copying the chimp. Now, suddenly the entire experiment was flipped because the chimp was no longer becoming human. The human was becoming chimp-like. Donald began imitating chimp sounds and mimicking chimp behaviors. He was adopting communication patterns that were not human, and researchers became increasingly worried about his language development. The experiment had to end early after only 9 months, not because it had failed, but because it succeeded in a way that terrified everyone involved. It revealed something very profound. Humans don't just teach behavior, we absorb it, especially when we're young. And suddenly, if you think back on that knowledge, all of the stories we have been talking about start to look quite different. The wolf children, the feral children, the ancient legends. Maybe people were not witnessing transformations, maybe they were witnessing adaptation. Because the closer science looks at human behavior, the more we discover something absolutely remarkable and also slightly terrifying. Human beings are not nearly as fixed as we would like to think they are. We are actually quite adaptable, flexible, moldable, and under the right circumstances, we can become almost anything, including perhaps something our ancestors might have mistaken for a werewolf. Okay, let's zoom out for just a second because we have covered a lot of ground. We've been to ancient Rome, ancient Greece, we talked about Vikings, medieval France, Germany, wolf children, psychology, chimpanzees, and questionable scientific decision-making. But somehow, we are still talking about werewolves, which really raises an interesting question. Why? Why does this story keep showing up? Why do civilizations separated by oceans, continents, languages, religions, and thousands of years keep inventing some version of the exact same culture? Because the werewolf is not uniquely European, not even close. Stories of humans becoming animals appeared all over the world. There was different names and different details, but it was always the same fear. And that's where it starts getting really interesting because once you look past the fur and the claws, the fangs, the full moon, you realize something cool. The werewolf was never about wolves. It was always just about us. For most of the story, wolves occupied a very strange place in the human imagination and people feared them. They also respected them because wolves were one of those few predators that looked very familiar to us. They lived in family groups like we do. They protected their young like we do. They cooperated together in a community like we do. They could communicate to each other like we do. They would hunt together like we do. They established social hierarchies and they teach their offspring just like us. Human beings spent thousands of years competing with them for the same resources, the same prey, the same territory, the same survival strategies. And in a weird way, wolves were almost like another version of us, a rival civilization living just beyond the firelight, which may explain why cultures became obsessed with the idea of crossing that line, of becoming one with the wolf. The wolf represented something humans understood all too well: survival, violence, family, loyalty, predation, the best and the worst parts of human nature wrapped up in fur. Now here's where things get psychological because almost every werewolf story shares something in common, and that would be the transformation. Now, that transformation isn't usually physical though, not really. It's more emotional, psychological, moral. Think about Lycaon, the first werewolf in Greek mythology. He became a wolf because of his cruel nature. Think about medieval werewolves. They were accused of abandoning their morality, giving into violent impulses, becoming savages. Early modern werewolves followed the same formula. A normal person who loses control and something inside takes over and suddenly they're just no longer themselves. Sound familiar? Well, It's because it's not really a story about wolves, it's just a story about people. It's about rage, violence, addiction, fear, the parts of ourselves that we would rather pretend just simply don't exist. The werewolf is humanity's oldest cautionary tale. The monster isn't out there. It's what happens when we stop being human, and honestly, I think that is way scarier than a giant dog running through the woods. All right, so let's add another layer to this and talk about the science of the werewolf. Because modern researchers think that several real-world phenomena may have actually contributed to the werewolf legends, and some of them are surprisingly convincing. The first one is rabies, and this one is huge because before vaccines, rabies was absolutely terrified. People who became infected with it could experience aggression, biting behavior, confusion, hallucinations, animal-like behavior, hypersensitivity to sound and light, a fear of water. And because the disease often spread through animal bites, it's really not hard to imagine how ancient communities connected the dots. Wolf bites led to strange behavior, led to violence, led to madness, and congratulations, you just accidentally invented the werewolf. Then we have hypertrichosis. It's a pretty rare condition. It's sometimes called werewolf syndrome. And really, it's where people who have this condition grow extraordinary amounts of hair all over their bodies and faces. Imagine seeing someone with this condition in the 1500s. You don't understand genetics or medicine or scientific things like that because they haven't been discovered yet. So you would probably assume that something supernatural was happening because honestly, you would have no better explanation. And next we have what's probably the strangest one of all. It's a real psychological condition known as clinical lycanthropy. Now, in these rare cases, individuals genuinely believe that they are transforming into animals. They are not pretending, they are not joking, they are not role-playing. They actually believe it's happening. Patients have reported feeling fur growing all over their bodies, believing their jaws were changing size and shape, experiencing animal urges, and identifying as wolves or dogs. Now, this is actually incredibly rare, but it does exist, and it demonstrates something important. The human brain is capable of some very, very strange things. Now, before we wrap up, we need to talk about something very important, because the wolf stories didn't begin and end in Europe. Many indigenous cultures throughout North America have very long traditions that involved wolves. But here's where people get confused. These stories are not simply Native American versions of werewolves. They are often something entirely different. In many traditions, wolves were not thought of as monsters. They were teachers, guides, protectors, symbols of something intelligent, symbols of survival. Now, among numerous indigenous cultures, wolves represented things like loyalty, family, endurance, cooperation, and those were traits that people admired, traits that they wanted to emulate. And while some traditions contain stories involving shapeshifters or spiritual transformation, these stories often served a very different cultural purpose than European werewolf legends. They aren't necessarily horror stories, they're actually spiritual teachings, like lessons, warnings, cultural history. And that's really fascinating because it shows us something really cool. Europe looked at the wolf and saw a monster, but indigenous cultures looked at the wolf and they saw a teacher. The same animal, but a completely different conclusion. And honestly, that is one of the most interesting things we've talked about in this entire episode. So after thousands of years, why are we still telling these stories? Why do werewolves survive when so many other legends have disappeared? Well, it's because every generation rediscovers the same fear. The fear of losing control, of becoming something else, the fear that civilization is thinner than we would really like to believe. And history has shown us something very uncomfortable. Humans are incredibly adaptable. The feral children proved that, Donald and Gua proved that, psychology proved that. Under the right circumstances, human behavior can change dramatically. Not into wolves, probably anyway, but enough that our ancestors might have looked at the results and said, that is not human anymore. And maybe that's the secret behind the whole werewolf story. Not that humans became wolves, but that wolves became a perfect symbol for what humans feared becoming. Because when you strip away all of the mythology, all the folklore, the silver bullets, the full moons, you're left with a very, very old question, and one that we've been asking for thousands of years. How much of civilization is learned, and how much of the animal is still underneath it? So let's go back to the woods. It's dark and the fire's dying and the trees are swaying, and somewhere beyond the edge of the light, something is howling. For thousands of years, that sound has meant something very different to every culture that heard it. To the Romans, it was a symbol of survival. To the Greeks, it was a warning about what happens when we abandon our humanity. To the Vikings, it was strength. To medieval Europe, it was terror. To indigenous cultures in North America, it was wisdom, family, and endurance. And to modern society, It's a reminder that human beings are far more adaptable than we really want to think. Tonight we follow the werewolf from ancient psychology through royal murder and wolf-raised twins, through Viking warriors and medieval witch hunts, through serial killers, feral children, psychological experiments, and centuries of fear. And what we found was really surprising. The werewolf was never really one creature. It was just a mirror that reflects whatever people feared most at the time. Sometimes it reflected predators lurking in the wilderness, and sometimes it reflected violence hiding inside of human beings, and sometimes it just reflected our fear of losing control. And then some other times it even reflected the uncomfortable truth that civilization might be a much thinner layer than we thought. Because the more we learn about feral children, the more we study human development, the more we understand how flexible the human brain really is, the more we discover something our ancestors suspected all along. Under the right circumstances, people can change in extraordinary ways. Not necessarily into wolves, but into something our ancestors might not have known how to explain. If you enjoyed today's episode into folklore, mythology, history, psychology, and humanity's favorite nightmare, make sure to like this episode, subscribe to the channel, and join me for the next file. And until the next time comes, stay curious and maybe don't go wandering through the woods alone at 2 a.m.